What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch back here with another week of your fantasy football stardom and situm, this time for week number 10 of the 2019 NFL season. And that means that we are pretty close to getting the fantasy playoffs. We are in the range of the fantasy season where you're trying to determine whether you're going to be able to make that playoff run. You're setting your lineups, you're making your final trades, you're making your final adds and your drops in terms of formulating that roster to making a run for the playoffs. Hopefully you're in a position for the playoffs, and if you're not, I'm going to try and get you to the playoffs with these recommended starts and sits. Before I do give you those starts and sits, Gronk spike the like button, subscribe to the channel for more NFL and fantasy football content, and comment below your opinion. What do you think of my starts and sits, first off, and then what questions do you have for me? Let me know in the comment section below who you think you should start at the running back, wide receiver, quarterback, tight end positions. These are my starts and my sits this week. Let's kick it off with the quarterback starts. Kyler Murray versus the Tampa Bay Bucks. Tampa is allowing the third most passing yards per game this season and the fourth most points to quarterbacks. Kyler Murray has been a little bit up and down this season for fantasy, but this week he should see a big week because Tampa Bay, they allow a lot of points to fantasy wide receivers. They are very good versus the run, which means that Kyler and the game plan for Cliff should be, okay, we're passing the football in this one. Also, Russell Wilson just played Tampa Bay. Kyler Murray's like Russell Wilson light. That's the comparison. So Kyler Murray should have a big game versus Tampa Bay. On the flip side, on the other side of the ball, Jameis Winston versus the Cardinals. Jameis was an excellent start last week versus Seattle. He's been very good for fantasy for the most part, at least recently, and I recommend you start him again. You keep him in your lineups. Cardinals, they've allowed the most points to quarterbacks this season, and a league worst 24 touchdowns allowed through the air. Jameis Winston is on fire. Mike Evans is on flames. He's going off, and of course Godwin's playing well, so that passing game is the heart and soul of the Bucs. This should be a high-scoring game. I'd start both quarterbacks in that game. Jacoby Brissett, I understand he is playing Miami, but first, he might not play this game. He is injured. He's coming off that injury versus the Steelers. We'll have to see if he does play. If he plays, I recommend you do start him. The Dolphins are third to last in touchdowns allowed through the air this season, and they've only picked off quarterbacks this year 3 times, which is the second worst. So not only are they allowing a lot of touchdowns, but they're not getting many turnovers. Daniel Jones versus the Jets. If you watch that game versus Miami, you understand why I have Daniel Jones here as a recommended start. Hasn't been the greatest fantasy quarterback, but the Jets are awful versus the pass. They have Tremaine Johnson out for the year. Darryl Roberts is banged up and questionable. Of course, CJ Mosley is out. Just a lot of their key pieces in both their secondary and their linebacking core is vacant. They're injured. They're hurt. And Fitzpatrick took advantage. He had 288 yards and 3 touchdowns. Daniel Jones can replicate that. I think a lot of passes to Saquon, a lot of passes to Golden Tate. Their linebackers in New York are awful in space and coverage. I expect Daniel Jones to have maybe the best game of his young career. Jimmy G versus Seattle. Seattle is the worst they've been defensively in a long time, and Jimmy G should have a big game here after that momentum he had versus the Cardinals on Thursday night. That was his best game as a 49er, maybe, possibly, but at least of this season. And the Seahawks are not very good versus the pass. They've allowed the third most passing yards this season, and they've actually allowed on average 300 per game on their last 3. Quarterback sits. The sit every week, Baker Mayfield versus Buffalo. Baker Mayfield is overrated. He stinks right now. He's arguably playing the worst of any starting quarterback. The Bills are very good versus the pass. They rank 3rd versus the pass this season, and they're the only team not named New England or San Francisco who is allowing less than 200 yards per game through the air. So sit Baker Mayfield. Sam Darnold versus the Giants. The Jets are a mess. I don't care if this is a juicy matchup on paper. Darnold is truly seeing ghosts and is playing awful. Him and Baker Mayfield. The Giants are actually not awful versus the pass lately. They've only allowed 220 yards per game over their last 3, so I would not expect Darnold to be the one to really open it up and take advantage of a weak secondary in New York. Jared Goff versus Pittsburgh. The Steelers' defense is very, very underrated. There's no Brandon Cooks to stretch the field, meaning Pittsburgh will be able to play up on the short routes of Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. The offensive line could struggle versus a good pass rush in Pittsburgh, and actually the Steelers are only allowing 174 yards at home this season through the air. So Pittsburgh's drastically better at home defensively. Jared Goff is drastically worse on the road. I would sit Jared Goff this week. Kirk Cousins versus Dallas. No Adam Thielen. Count me out for Kirk Cousins anytime he doesn't have Adam Thielen, but now he plays a Dallas Cowboys defense that ranks 5th versus quarterbacks this season, and they've only allowed 7 touchdowns through the air this season. That's the 3rd best in the league. My running back starts. Montgomery versus Detroit. Lions are dead last versus running backs this season. Montgomery has actually found a rhythm despite Chicago not being a very good offense in general. Mark Ingram versus Cincinnati. The Bengals are allowing 177 yards per game on the ground. That is 27 more yards than any other rush defense. So the Bengals, they give up a lot of yards on the ground, the most. Next, Singletary versus Cleveland. The Browns, they've allowed the 3rd most rushing yards this season per game. Singletary had 23 touches versus Washington. Very quietly, not a lot of people talking about him. He's a great guy to have on your roster for the rest of the season. Ronald Jones versus Arizona. He had 18 carries, a lot like Singletary taking over the touches in his backfield. He had 18 carries versus Seattle, had a couple catches as well. Now he plays Arizona in a high-scoring matchup. I could see him hitting the end zone. I think he's good for the stretch run. Jamal Williams versus Carolina. He's been solid in a complementary role to Aaron Jones. The Panthers, they've allowed the most touchdowns to running backs this season on the ground. I say that Williams is a pretty good bye-week fill this week. Running back sits, Joe Mixon. Now I understand he's coming off his best game this season, really, but he's playing Baltimore. They're 2nd best versus the run this season. They're a very good run defense. That's what they do. They're big up front. They'll dominate Cincinnati's offensive line. And also the game script, guys. He might get a couple receptions here and there, but Lamar, that offense should be able to dominate. So I would sit Mixon if you do have the depth in order to do so. Freeman versus New Orleans, same sort of thing. The Saints, they've only allowed 44 yards a game over their last 3 on the ground. Plus, the game script is likely to favor New Orleans in the fact that Freeman will probably not be getting very many carries on the ground because the Saints will be blowing out Atlanta. Mccoy versus Tennessee, just 24% of the snaps in that backfield in the last couple of games for Shady McCoy. He seems to really be dwindling in terms of his role in the backfield for Kansas City. And if with Mahomes possibly back in the fold, that could mean that McCoy is even less getting the ball less on the ground. Frank Gore versus Cleveland. The same thing with Shady. Not getting the ball as much. He did have 11 carries last week, but was super inefficient with all of them. He's lost his starting job to Singletary. It's a pretty good matchup, so if you do not have any other better options, sure, you can start him maybe as a flex guy, but you probably could find a better option than Frank Gore this week. Todd Gurley versus Pittsburgh. The Steelers have allowed just 77 yards per game over their last 3 on the ground. I'm not a huge fan of Gurley this season in general, and like I said with Goff, I think the same thing happens here where the defensive line of the Steelers might physically dominate the offensive line of the Rams. My wide receiver starts, Pascal versus Miami. No T.Y. Hilton means Pascal is up as the number 1 receiver, and the Finns have allowed the most touchdowns to receivers this season. Emmanuel Sanders versus Seattle. The Hawks have allowed the most or second most receptions to wide receivers this season, and they've allowed 2 top 6 wideouts in their last 2 games. You saw what Mike Evans was able to do. Kyle Shanahan will have a good scheme with 10 days of preparation versus the Seahawks defense. Brown, Marquise Brown, not John Brown this week, versus Cincinnati. I think Cincinnati, because they're so bad versus the run, they'll commit a lot of resources to the box and stopping Lamar and Mark Ingram, allowing for Marquise Brown to beat them over the top. A lot of the Bengals guys in the secondary are also injured, so that allows Marquise Brown to have a good matchup one-on-one. Kirk versus Tampa Bay. The Bucs have allowed the most points to wide receivers this season, so Kirk is in line for probably a big game along with Kyler Murray. Crowder versus the Giants. A big game last week. That should continue. Him and Bell are the only guys I really trust right now in fantasy for the Jets. G-men have allowed the most yards to wide receivers this season. Wide receiver sits. Odell Beckham Jr. Yes, even me, a big Beckham fan, is willing to admit that he is a lost cause in fantasy this year because Mayfield stinks, and he's playing the Bills, who have yet to allow an opposing receiver to have over 100 yards receiving this season. Not a single 100-yard receiver this year. Odell, he'll be fine if you don't have anyone else to play. He'll probably get some targets and, around 50 to 70 yards, but don't expect anything special this week. Juju, he's playing Jalen Ramsey. That's going to be a shadow fest all day long. I would shade away from starting Juju. Ridley versus New Orleans has not been overly efficient, especially with Matt Schaub at quarterback versus New Orleans. I just don't see this as a good matchup for Ridley. Davis versus Kansas City. The Chiefs are actually better versus the pass than I've given them credit for and that most people will give them credit for. They are actually 5th best versus wide receivers this season. Plus Claiborne, since he's been there, has been a pretty good number 1 for them at cornerback. Boyd versus Baltimore. The last time Boyd played Baltimore, he saw a lot of Humphrey. In that game, he only had 10 yards. So I would shy away from Boyd, especially with the new quarterback at the helm in Finley. Tight end starts. Mike Gesicki of the Dolphins versus Indianapolis. Fitzpatrick has been known to target the tight end, and Gesicki saw his best game of his career so far last week versus the Jets. This week, the Colts, they're actually one of the bottom 10 teams versus tight end. So I think Gesicki's not a bad bye-week fill if you need one. Jonnu Smith versus Kansas City. The Chiefs have allowed 55 receptions to the tight end position. That's the 3rd most this year. So the Chiefs are good versus receivers, but they do allow a lot of catches to tight ends. So if anyone has a good game for the Titans, it's probably going to be Jonnu. Then you look at Jason Witten versus Minnesota. Witten's been a good start pretty much every week at tight end, at least like a solid start. You're not going to lose your week because of Jason Witten. He actually has at least 6 targets in 3 consecutive games. So if he's out there, or if you need a bye week fill for one of your tight ends, Jason Witten is about the best option you can get out there. Everett versus Pittsburgh. Cooks is out. There'll probably be more 2 tight end sets for Sean McVay's offense. Also, Pittsburgh is pretty susceptible to tight ends, specifically in the red zone, so I would expect Everett to have probably one of his better games of the season. And Doyle versus the Dolphins. Without Hilton, Doyle kind of becomes that go-to guy for a reception on 3rd down, and especially with Brissett there, that would be a good option. But even with Brian Hoyer, a quarterback that's going to be a little bit safer and conservative, Doyle would be a good play. Those are my starts and my sits for week number 10 of the 2019 season. If you enjoyed, Gronk spike the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It's Mitch. Thanks for watching. Peace out.